everyone. Welcome to Tectonic Affairs' first video entry. Sorry for the lack of content recently. As everyone can probably relate, writing about things that aren't uplifting during this difficult time was proving to be really stressful, so I took a bit of a break. After 2 weeks, though, I feel like I'm finally able to focus and regroup. Today, I had the very special honor of video chatting with the illustrious Dr. Christine Ogilvie Hendren. Dr. Hendren is an assistant research professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Duke. She's also the executive director for the Center for the Environmental Implications of Nanotechnology, and she's also the founder and chair of INTEREACH. So she's very accomplished. Her work focuses on knowledge integration and co-generation within complex interdisciplinary research teams, so what she refers to as team science. In this interview, we talk about her current research in nanomaterials, how collaboration makes us better researchers, and how to mitigate risk in the field of sex robots. So it's pretty interesting. I had a great time talking to her, and I hope that you guys enjoy it. How would you describe your research to someone who's not in your field?
That's a really good one. So I guess maybe I will probe with a follow-up question to make sure I answer your question well.
Yeah.
So my research falls into, it's turned out like several buckets. And so one of them is kind of environmental implications of new technologies and how do we forecast those at the same time that the technologies are coming into existence. So when they're emerging and there's something different or new about them, either technologically, chemically, or because there's something about the use of the technology that falls through governance cracks. Like, you know, maybe the technology is something that could have existed before, but the way it's being used, it's not quite a drug, it's not quite a product, it's not quite like a, program or something. So something about the new technology or chemical then is going to potentially cause collateral risks that were unintended, or just pose new trade-offs about the kind of decisions that would need protections for the environment and for people. So that's kind of the background of what I do. Through that, I guess the next bucket that I got into because of realizing how much integration across disciplines was needed for all of the risk assessment stuff and forward looking. And I got really into a field that's the science of team science and integration and implementation science, which is basically the scholarship of like, how do you do that linking across? So working with government agencies and NGOs and researchers and industry to figure out, okay, what's the piece of knowledge that we need to get next to make the better decision, and kind of teasing out the differences between the knowledge held in those different places and also the intentions, values, and motivations and held in those different places, and kind of trying to make all those clear so that we can say, what are the goals of any given, mission, like environmental protection or, responsible innovation or whatever. And then how is it that we need to kind of prioritize our next research to make decisions intelligently about reaching those goals. So it's kind of like the research area of this emerging technology risk assessment and environmental and health implications. And then the meta field of this integration and implementation sciences. I kind of do both of those things now because I feel like I have to get intentionally good at the meta level in order to apply it well at the problem level for sustainability type of concepts.
Right. So I guess that's kind of the basis behind why you founded INTEREACH. And did it start based on you have a problem and you're thinking oh, maybe someone else is doing this project? Did it go base up, or did you kind of think of it in reverse where oh, we have this overarching problem and we need it at the base level?
That's such a intelligently thought of question, because I think really it came bottom up if I'm thinking historically. So one of the things that I really always love to talk about is the importance of having humanists in what is often like a really STEM heavy culture
Okay.
around, science decisions. People, a lot of times when they talk interdisciplinarily, they'll say like, oh yeah, we also have a lawyer and a policy person and a scientist and an engineer. But I really feel strongly that we need philosophers, anthropologists, historians in that mix equally and especially upfront. So that aside, I brought up because I befriended this anthropologist who studied science and technology and society, and
That's
she
cool.
wanted, she was so awesome, and she wanted to study me in my role trying to pull together all of these different pieces of the nano implications puzzle. And so through her, she invited me to the Team Science conference and said, why don't you just tell people about your job? And I was like, who even comes to this? What is even the audience? What do I say? And she was like, just tell people what you've noticed. And so that was my first time kind of putting together the meta things about like, this is what's challenging about this role. And people don't know what kind of animal I am, so they don't know how to interact with me. And I don't know where to publish anything and all these things. But here's why I think this is important work, because I'm in enough rooms, like I span the language, I kind of point out, I think we're all saying this, let's go this way. And so I gave this talk, and to be honest, I partially took the invitation because it was in Austin, and I have a lot of great friends in Austin. And I was
Yeah.
like, okay, well, I'll see them and I'll try this thing. And and after that talk, I've never before that had the experience where so many people came up and they were like, oh my gosh, that's me. That's me. I don't have any colleagues where I am, but I'm doing this knowledge brokering integration stuff.
Oh, cool.
And it happened so much that I was like, whoa, this is our flock. But like, none of us have a flock. So over the next couple of years, I kept going to that meeting. And then I had like a real ad hoc. I was like, everybody who, in between sessions, everybody who thinks of themselves in this, I called it at the time, interdisciplinary executive scientist role. Come give me your business card, and then we'll go from there. So like this huge group of people, I still have the little stack of business cards. And then I just like really lowbrow, like made a listserv and was like, who wants to be a group? And then one weekend, I just like made a logo in PowerPoint and threw up the website and said, this is what we're going to try to do. But it was not only me. The reason I was able to do that is because these two powerhouse women who really were the foundation of integration and implementation science and the science of team science, Holly Falk-Krasinski and Gabrielle Bammer, were like super supportive. They were like, what you're doing is awesome. Definitely make this sub community. We will put our names on this thing. We will help you. And like, they were just so generative. Like I would throw out these thoughts, speaking about the bubble up from the bottom. I would be like, oh, there should be rules about this. There should be intentional career paths. So you could grow up and say, I want to be a this, instead of like, oh, I just didn't end up going tenure track, but like this job is kind of good. And I'm smart enough to do it, so I'll just do it. And it was very organic. And it was totally possible for them to be like, yeah, I've been doing this for years, buddy. Like, get on board, read my papers. But instead, they were like, this is awesome. It may be interesting to you to read this textbook that I wrote where 4 chapters cover exactly what you just thought you thought of, but like really, really helpful. And that made me really think of the importance of like a radically inclusive, no, that's our whole world now, right? Like I might have some streakers, little children running through at some point. So, but anyway, it made me realize like, oh, this feels more like student activities and clubs and like things that I had done before where it was fun and social and we were all really committed to the same goal and we just wanted to do like community effective work together in an environment that was awesome. And it was like, but wait, this is also professional. And I was like, oh, well, we can just build that. We can just make it this way. And it has been so fun. So with their help, I got it stood up. They kind of backed off because they were like, we are starting a million other societies and we're super important. And they didn't have time, but they just kind of like gave the blessing, put their name, and then I went from there. And then we just sort of grew the listserv. So now it's like 325 people. And then we have like monthly webinars and and people just kind of share their experiences, and our goals are sort of developing the profession, like making the case that people should pay for this type of a career, and then professional development. So then if that's the case, like how do we establish training and education for the skill sets and knowledge and kind of methods of what we're saying is important.
Right. And do you feel like having like that kind of collaborative atmosphere is furthering research along before, like when you originally had it individualized, do you feel like morale is higher as well as more work's getting done because you have things, people to bounce ideas off of, as well as I guess you're excited about the work because you have other people to work with?
Yeah, definitely. Yes to all those things. Like, one, it's just validating because before it was like a lot of tacit knowledge and intuition and hunches and what people often call soft skills, which I have mixed feelings about, you know.
Yeah.
But but at least there's a name for it, right? And now having these other people to say, look, I had this situation, here's how I tried to handle it. I always have this feeling like maybe there was a best practice, maybe there was another tool, and having people to bounce that off of, and also just having people that are kind of simpatico, like they see themselves in you, like they're like, oh, I'm the one in the room that sees people fighting, thinks I can hear a middle ground, and then tries to like steer them into it, and that's a fun puzzle for me. Like some people are like, oh, get me back to my statistics, I hate that, you know. So it's been neat to find each other, one, so we can trust ourselves better to be like, oh no, that was a thing, that was work that needed doing, and we can kind of elevate it. And then since then it's just kind of caught, there's been a moment of like convergence has taken off within the National Science Foundation as a, a core area, like, you know, in the big ideas that are being funded. So last year I actually tried, or I guess 2 years ago now, I finally just went for it and put a proposal in. And I'm losing even the word proposal with this pandemic. I'm like, what's the thing? That's my whole job. Okay. But I put a proposal in with me as the PI, and I was not doing any of the science, but it was to a joint program between biology and nanoscience. And I put it in with my claimed discipline as I2S, or integration and implementation science, instead of civil and environmental engineering. And I was like, they'll either like this or not, but it's supposed to be about convergence. So I put it in and was like, okay, my role will be converging across the disciplines. I'm going to do it in these ways. We're going to have a cohort of students and really try to like answer questions that we couldn't have answered without each other's discipline. So we have like a biogeochemistry person working with like a cell biologist. I'm not doing either of those things, but those science outputs are like all of our research. So it was a big gamble, and I was like, I guess I want to just see if the NSF really does want this type of convergence expertise. And we won.
Oh,
So
congrats, man.
it was kind of a shock, but it was really validating. And then it started to feel like, you know, INTEREACH people having colleagues and then being funded for this thing. People are, I guess, taking it seriously that it is important to really have these methods in order to get the right answers. And then separately, I think it's also important for the people. It's not quite like a facilitator that would just have these particular skills. I personally think it's really important to be like fluent and have a scientific or disciplinary background that's adjacent to the problem, so that, like you're saying, with fracking and stuff, you can, like, you need to be fluent in the problem so that you don't waste anybody's time, because it's the most precious resource, right? So you're like, I know the language, I know something about what the main problems are, and so melding those two has been like really gratifying and fun to see, to answer your question, better science coming out of it. Like, because now I'm more confident in being like, time out, did you hear that you both asked this question? And isn't that interesting that we have this uncertainty at the intersection? And that might have before been something that I thought but didn't say. And now I feel confident to like stop the meeting, point it out to people, and then have PIs be like, oh, that is something. So like it's been really fun.
That's been really cool, and it's also really cool to, I'm sure for you to see like all this effort you've been doing over the past few years be rewarded with like monetary grants and people believing in the process and the project as well. Um, so yeah, the reason I wanted to talk to you as well is because of the inherent nature of like um, of your like I guess your work as also implementing into policy. Like you do seminars for the EPA and everything. Like I was just wondering how you first started becoming a person who like advises people who write policy as well as becoming like an environmental activist as well. Like how do we make people care about these problems that are arising?
That's a really good question. Well, my story for how I got involved is I was really fortunate to have an opportunity to do a fellowship, sort of like a postdoc, but during the last year of my PhD work at the EPA. So I worked there about half time um, on at the National Center for Environmental Assessment. And I think just being there as a, you know, really a fellow helping to shape some case studies that they were working on and like learning through osmosis partially the constraints that they face and the different lens that they have to see things through helped me understand like what would be it gave me some access to empathy I wouldn't have necessarily had before that for what information needs to be packaged in a way that's digestible for uptake and use by different people. So like for example, sending a ton of papers to the EPA is not helpful because unless they have a person whose job it is to like weed through that and get like the most important things. But I guess I just learned how to interact in a way that would answer questions they have. So like they need to know what do they recommend, what threshold, how do they interface with businesses that may be affected by new regulations and, all these different things. And I think it really is just having access to like a different set of lenses where it's like, this is what's important to the problems they are trying to solve. And then how, from a different vantage point, can I package the things I think are important in a way that is going to be like fit that puzzle piece of the problems they are charged with solving. I don't know if that makes sense the way I'm saying
Yeah,
it.
it's kind of like learning how to make it palatable in your future work as well as like while you were working there. I think is kind of interesting. It's like it affects how you're framing the things you say now rather than just going down a long rabbit hole of a project and then sending them to the paper.
Right. Yeah. And if I just say it the way that's important to a researcher, then inevitably I'll end up explaining the cool thing that I learned, the next best research question, and why we need more money. Right. And that's
Yeah.
not interesting to them, but that's what the researchers' takeaway is. But
Mhm.
so, sort of similar like to any industry experience where you're like, okay, well, they're going to need to know how can they justify this investment or whatever it is that they like are charged with solving. So I think that, I mean, you're doing such a cool thing with this blog of trying to make the case for why a thing should be cared about and like make that leap for the person, like spoon feeding the leap, right? Of like, this matters. Endpoint B is like what matters in your life. And then
Right.
here's how this is going to like move that needle. And here's how you need to help make it move it in the right direction for all of us. Like,
Right. And like I kind of came up with the idea. I was finishing up a summer internship at this oil and gas company that I really liked working for. And my mentor was this like really whip smart geologist. And she was like, look, like you're about to present in front of all the management. This is what they want to know. This is why it matters and all this kind of stuff. And the way she was so like succinct and concise and like straight to the point, I was like, yes, we need to do this with everything. Cause you go to all these research seminars and you hear like, you can tell the difference between a good one and a bad one because of like, okay, at the beginning, they tell you why it matters. At the end, they tell you, and in the middle, they keep reminding you like, all right, and this is going to come into play with this. And so it's really interesting to see how the different disciplines, this goes a lot with your work, is like industry, science, and like like talking with my friends, like how do I explain my research to them where like they might not be coming from geology background, but they still want to know and like how it affects their day-to-day life. And I'm like, okay, you're driving your car to work. This is why it matters, kind of thing. And so yeah,
Yes.
just implementing all of it. So I do want to talk about it because the reason I got interested in your work is because Jason was talking about like right after your BBC article came out,
Hmm.
which I thought was so interesting, and the discrepancy between like nanoparticles in different objects and
Hmm.
the publicity each one gets based on which one's more easy to talk about in the media. Like
Right.
if you want to just talk about your projects with like plastic particles as well as like morality of text robots and everything like that, like just however you want to start it.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a really interesting uh, place that the research went to. So I have worked with, uh, oh, sorry. I have worked with the Consumer Product Safety Commission for a long time. And they are awesome. Though most of the ways that we get protected are from laws that are just hanging out there that are like, okay, manufacturers have to follow these particular things
Right.
or they're in breach. But how do you find out they're in breach? That's why recalls happen, right? Is because enough people run up and say like, oh, my kid was hurt. And everyone's like definitely going to run out and say if their kid is hurt with any product. But like you mentioned, there are these other classes of products, and sex toys and sex robots fall into them, where people are much less likely for a whole variety of reasons to report damage.
Mm-hmm.
um, and because of that, there's not an elevated, like not everything can be priority one, so the squeaky wheel gets the grease big time in this case.
Right.
And so it's sort of an uncharted territory, and we started realizing there were these studies that show that in just regular sex toys, not even adding the convergence aspect of AI and robotics, but just in regular ones, the exact same uh, endocrine disruptors that have been banned in children's toys and plastics,
Mm-hmm.
the same endocrine disruptor in the same plastic has been found up to 70% by weight in
Wow.
like a variety of like jelly sex toys. So like it's just radically, it's the exact same thing. And now I will also say like another red flag for different prioritization is children's use. So
Mm-hmm.
hopefully there is like a small chance of overlap between children and this products, right? But
Yeah, please.
but the reason is partly because they gum things, and so then these plastics are in touch with like sensitive body parts and mucous membranes, which is
Right.
exactly what they're designed for in adults. We're like, wow, we need to elevate this so that there will be public pressure, enough notice of this that it can be justifiably elevated in priority as a product class. And at the same time, then we realized, okay, with convergence of AI in robots, along with like, the chemical risks and the physical risks of these things, then it's like a perfect example of, okay, we really need to figure out who decides these things, because it's kind of a consumer product, it's kind of a medical device, and there's not really like a tight governance structure for deciding, navigating personal freedom and freedom of speech and all of these things that are important to us as a society, but then also saying like, how are we're actively designing these robots that are like, human sized, that have AI components that are like intentionally um, affecting the cognition and the psychological and emotional states of people. And um, and there's all these like subclasses of this, right? So there's this one sex robot maker that has a setting called Frigid Farah. Have you seen this? And
I don't know what the terminology for frigid fair is. Is this more of like the where they kind of do what you want them to do, or
this
kind of
is
setting?
where you program her. It's like every level of this is offensive. It's Frigid Farah makes her protest and beg you to stop.
Ooh, yeah. So
So
this is gonna arise problems, kind of like with shooter games. Does it cause violence, or is this preventing like rape in real life by having it simulated with a sex robot, and kind of like, I mean, you mentioned in the article also with pedophilia and how that problem comes to play. Like, how would you address that?
Right. So my big thing that I've been kind of going to is that who I we need like clinicians and clinical psychologists to help weigh in on these things. Like we need to make sure that we're getting all the right experts at the table for it. So like I can have emotional reactions and even personal judgments and thoughts about whether or not there should be child sex dolls, but they shouldn't really be part of the calculus when we have experts that could bring it in and say, like, I could imagine someone saying, yeah, actually, this is an unfortunate brain wiring. And if these people have, like, maybe there are epidemiological or, data that show, in fact, this does reduce harm to children to have these dolls out there. So I feel like my big drum to beat is just like respecting expertise and bringing the right expertise in to make decisions on this stuff, rather than we've kind of used like this sort of puritanical knee jerk, and that slices both ways. Like, don't look at the sex toys; they're not out there, or like they're just hurting dirty people, so don't care about it. Which I've, like that it's not the intelligent scientific way that decisions should be made. Whereas like I could also see people saying like, actually with the rape scenario, you're normalizing horrible behavior, like the first person shooter thing, rather than like, is it an off valve or is it a,
Like a
helping?
release. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's one of those things where the technology is progressing so fast that instead of having like retroactive policy like you would with a recall kind of thing, the products and AI is developing so fast, you have kind of have to, like you said, get a lot of people to be experts and weigh in as soon as possible because it's advancing so quickly before you have some sort of like, oh, this is product has been out for a year, maybe we should now recall it kind of thing, or just how to, yeah, like how to predict and mitigate the risks that you might foresee. And also it's, I mean, what do you think about it disproportionately affecting like vulva owning individuals with I don't know, like sex toys, as well as, I mean, the sex robots are predominantly gendered as women. Yeah.
Like the actual exposure to sex robots is hypothetical at this moment, and the
Mm-hmm.
actual current widespread exposure to over half the population, many of them LGBTQ, many of them vulva owning individuals, like I that it should be the priority because actual people are getting exposed to risk right now. It's not an idea.
Right.
And I get the sex robot is much more interesting than like vibrator, but it shouldn't
Mm-hmm.
be scientifically like that's our whole point is the numbers. But I do think that it brings up a lot about like we reveal a lot about who we care about in society by how we protect people, right? And there's like
Right.
a million examples of this, but it's interesting, and digging into the history of it got me fascinated too, because like we have paperback books because of porn novels. Like there's
Why
tons of ways.
paperback?
Isn't that interesting? Like there used to just be like hardbound novel or like books, and
Mm-hmm.
there's so many different ways that like the sex industry was a technology innovator and a revolutionary um, kind of impetus. So like streaming internet is that way.
Right.
Like you've probably heard like the VHS, like that technology came in. The actually beta was better, but VHS by somehow was taken up by the porn industry, and so that's why VHS beat beta. I think is the story.
Right.
I could be telling that part wrong because I don't know the history of business of it, but I know that there are multiple examples of where this the I mean, it's the oldest profession, right? Like it's a core human drive. It drives a
Yeah.
lot of innovation,
Yeah.
and it does so in shadows. And so that was kind of our point: is like, look, paperbacks. The collateral damage of that is maybe to trees, right? But like, I mean, and I love trees, so I
Yeah.
didn't mean. But like the collateral, the like developing this technology unexamined and pushed forward by, you know, by things that we're not going to talk about, could end up then like what happens when we have other robots, like when you think of paperback books, you don't think of porn novels, right? Like,
No,
so
yeah.
it's just, that's what books are, right? And but like the same thing will happen with robots, where like when you think of robots that are intentionally going to change how you think, feel, and act, and believe, and like there will come a time when it's like not just for sex robots, like it's that technology will be incubated in that area, but then it will exist after that, right?
So it'll,
So
yeah, it'll be driven by this need to create it, and then it'll just be like, oh, here's a side project that we did that becomes more of the mainstream.
yeah,
Interesting.
and
Yeah.
yeah, we could maybe, yeah, we could think about like all kinds of ways that might be bad. So
Wow. Man, I mean, this seems like, I mean, this is one of the very like definitions of emerging technologies. Do you think it's really beneficial to kind of have a foot in, like you said, you bring in historians as well as philosophers. Like, do you think it's really interesting to have, um, to be able to use the future and past, present, to be able to work in your present research?
yes, I have actively, well, like at first, I think I did, I would stress myself out because I just tried to do too much myself. And then I would be like, man, now I'm failing at being like a physicist because I'm only sort of dabbling in it, and I'm failing at being a historian. And then I was like, oh my gosh, wait, your entire point is integrating across people. So now I just have really enjoyed being able to seek out colleagues that are interested from different fields. So I got to be part of trying to recruit this unbelievably cool historian, and he does like the history of chemistry, chemical names, and periodic tables, and all this cool stuff. And he's a history teacher, and he came to Duke, and he was working on like exactly what I had been working on in nanoinformatics. Like, okay, what do we name all this stuff? How do we trade data back and forth? And we're inventing it and trying to codify it at the same time, knowing that like tons of what we're inventing is going to be like updated or wrong, or converge, diverging all the time. And he gave like his job talk blew my mind. I was like, you just described like perfectly some like barely like thoughts that I had started to form over like about patterns I think I'm seeing like over the last decade. But like it just made me realize, wait a minute, there's people who do this, like, and they do it well, and they can bring that to the table. And so now I've just tried to seek those people out, like look for anthropologists, historians, epistemologists who are more applied, who want to talk about these particular problems that I'm looking at, and then invite them either to give a guest lecture if it's a class, or really people self-select by their interest in bandwidth, because all this stuff is usually a side project, right? Because they're like, okay, my bread and butter is stuff that makes sense to people, that has been done before, but like this intersectional stuff, wow, that's cool. So yeah, I've just been kind of trying to bring those folks in, and realize it's been such a relief. Like I'm not going to be a historian. I didn't pick that path, and like
Right.
so but I can know historians, and now I'm like, oh, that's what I should do.
So did you, I mean, I know the position you have right now, it takes a lot of humility and a little bit of being humble to be able to have other experts weigh in, especially some people who have like a little bit of foot into what you're doing. Was that a problem at first? And did you have to like overcome anything to be able to be okay with asking so many people for help?
That's a really good question. Well, I am faculty now, but I spent a long time in academia as staff. And I don't know if from your vantage point as a master's student, if this is like something that jumps out at you or not, but there's a pretty, in many institutions, culturally stark line between faculty and staff.
Oh yeah.
And
Tenured,
especially
non-tenured as well.
totally, and like this alt academia track that I kind of was on, where I'm like executive director of this center and a research scientist, but like I'm not any type of professor for like the first 6 years that I was at Duke, after coming back. And so I would say that that kind of like baked in all the humility that I could need. Like I was coming at it from underneath. And so I kind of had to accept that going forward, but it did me a real big favor, which was learning how to kind of lead from underneath and like come to people in a way that's going to complement them and, you know, respect their vision. Um, and I think that that's the good way to lead from any vantage point. So now
Mhm.
that I am faculty, it has been really interesting to see how things change. I also stopped dyeing my hair like a few years ago, and that really changed things too. Like,
How so?
people listen to me better.
No way.
Yeah, isn't that wild? And I feel like the academia is maybe one of the only places where, uh, as a woman, like where it could in any way be advantageous to go gray because we're in such
Wow.
like, it's a whole other conversation about society, right? But I noticed
Mhm.
some interesting things about the different way. Like when I meet a new person now and they're like, oh, she's civil and environmental engineering faculty. People will be like, oh, okay, these are the ideas that like they just are able to hear ideas differently. And I don't think they're trying to be
Weird.
jerks. It's just like they know what kind of, they understand the metrics you're being judged on. And they're like, if you are being judged on these metrics and succeeding, then there's some sort of quality grade that's like having a, you know, organic stamp or like this person can do scholarship stamp. I think that's why they do it. They don't mean to maybe personally discount people. So anyway, all that is to say the humility thing I've been really interested in, and I want to remember always what it felt like to be not in the club of people who get taken
Right.
seriously for their ideas and like really model. So when I teach a class, I co-teach with other people, and this isn't everyone's favorite, but I really like to see if everyone will go by their first names, including the professors, when it's a project class, like when we're supposed to be making a project together, because then it just sort of like flattens the like it takes away the
Eliminates,
friction.
yeah, it eliminates the unnecessary barriers for connection, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also, I guess it's an example of being like I read this book over the summer written by this like Navy admiral or something called Turn the Ship Around. And he basically was assigned this really, this ship that was not doing very well productivity wise. And so he was like wondering why. So we went through all the steps of each midshipman's duties. And so it was kind of like reminding yourself where you came from and what you were doing and how to like put yourself in their shoes. And I think that's a really good way to do it by, I mean, you experienced the entire route to where you are now. And so you can really empathize with it. Where I feel like if you've been in academia for so long, you can kind of forget what the students are going through and how stressed they are and what they're dealing with. So I think that's really, I mean, it's a really good way to connect with people, I think.
Yeah, and it opens up all your possibilities of like learning from somebody. Like hierarchy does some good things. I've been thinking about it a ton in the COVID situation because all my different roles have different things that are happening right now, right? And a lot of the different groups have to get real militaristic real fast because in a crisis, you're like, there's deciders and there's doers, and
Right.
we don't have time for nice, you know, and sorry,
Mhm.
you're laid off. Sorry, you're this, like, you do this now in a way that you never would. You'd be like, let's have a meeting and talk about what we all think the goals are, you know, but
Right.
like spreadsheet by five, you know, and I've thought about it a lot of like, um, what the different cultures are that bring out the best in people um, and how much you miss when you're like when you use a hierarchy badly. Like this, those are examples of using a hierarchy to achieve the mission that is like right in front of your face. But
Mhm.
like a lot of times you just get into it by habit.
All right, so I think in order for time, I think I might wrap it up. But, all right, thank you, Dr. Hendren, for your time. That was a really great interview, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. All right, see you next time on Tectonic Affairs.